Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you all today, and impressed that we've found a way to all be together in community in these trying times. I'm recording this presentation on the offhand chance that there is some connection problem tomorrow during my session, so that there'll at least be a way to watch what I have to say. So I think that many of you may know me already from different contexts, and I have met many of you in previous semesters. But in the spirit of the transrational approach, I'll give a few bits of information about my background and what informs me as a peace researcher, and what informs me in particular in regards to this topic. So I'm originally from the United States, and the majority of my professional and educational background is in peace and conflict studies. I've always tried to position myself as a sort of hybrid scholar practitioner, trying to weave back and forth between the thinking and the doing. I spent many years working in peace process support, mostly in Southeast Asia and in a few other regions, and then spent some time as a freelance consultant and researcher. And in the past 2 or 3 years, I've been working for the Innsbruck program as well as the Paz a Mente program in Brazil. My interests are very broadly the field of transrational peace philosophy, peace research, mysticism, and most recently in the past 3 years, a main focus of my research has been on the intersection between peace and conflict studies and what we can broadly call existential risk research. I'll touch on this a bit in my talk today, but existential risk research basically looks at those things that threaten humans' long-term survivability on the planet Earth. So it engages with topics that are like, what is the role of artificial intelligence in peace and conflict? How should we conceptualize synthetic biology, nanotechnology, the threat of a great powers conflict, natural and engineered pandemics, as well as how will climate change influence the future of peace and conflict? One of the reasons that this area of study became very important for me was after many years of designing curricula and teaching different types of peace workers around the world, I came to see that there is a bit of a trend in peace research and peace thinking to be either very much in this moment or to be looking at how the past informs how we understand the present. And this is, of course, vitally important, but I have seen very little about how do we think about anticipating what will be important in the next 5 years, 10, 50, or 100 years. And how do we need to think about the changing face of the nature of peace and conflict? So I have several aims in our session here today. So our topic today is peace, pandemic, and conflict, and looking at exploring this nexus and how can we think about it. So what informs my perspective on this? Well, like all of you, I have spent the last year plus living through a pandemic, in addition to having spent a lot of time thinking and researching and talking to people about how we can conceptualize a peace and conflict perspective on this topic. I've also been able to experience the pandemic from the inside, from several different contexts. I've been in the Democratic Republic of Congo during the COVID peak and during the previous 2 Ebola outbreaks, as well as in the US during a peak in Wisconsin and in Madrid in Spain as well. So like all of you, I will have a lot of my own experiences that shape the way that I think about these things. So the main purpose or aim of my session here is several. The first is that the globe is always in the room, keeping in the spirit of transrational peace research and theme-centered interaction. So I know that this is something that is on our minds, and it is something that is very much affecting us. And I also want to give it space and permission to be held in this group, in this community, and let it be a fertile topic that we can engage with as peace thinkers and as peace researchers. Secondly, it's very obvious that the COVID pandemic has become one of the main trends shaping the world currently and stands to shape the world for the medium to long-term future. And even the very high likelihood that there will be pandemic diseases coming after COVID really stresses the importance in how we can understand what we have already learned and how that will inform our perspectives going forward into the future. My third aim is to entertain this concept of what is a peace and conflict studies perspective. This is something that I have very often been called on to answer this question, is what is a peace and conflict studies perspective on terrorism or countering violent extremism or on community dialogue? And it's always a bit of a difficult question for me to answer, because what does it mean to have a peace and conflict studies perspective? So we'll keep this in the back of our mind as we're exploring this topic today and working together towards developing what could be the start of a peace and conflict studies perspective on peace, pandemic, and conflict. And finally, the main overarching topic of these first 2 weeks here is an exploration of the moral and the modern peace frames. And I think that looking at the pandemic is a good opportunity for us to really explore both of these families. Because if we look at what most of the discussions in the media have been around the pandemic, as well as what the initial peace research on the pandemic has said, it tends to focus on one of these two trends or at the intersection between them, looking at what does the pandemic mean either in terms of security or what does it mean in terms of justice. So a few brief words on the structure of this session. Of course, I can't give you any final word or truth on this topic, but I'm going to spend the first bit of time giving my own thinking and reflections on what we can say about the pandemic from a peace and conflict perspective. And then I'd like to break us into some groups to have smaller discussions on the topic of what do we think are some of the most important questions at this nexus between peace, conflict, and pandemic, and why do we think those are important questions. And particularly that sub-question there I think is really important, the why are they important? Because this harkens back to my point before about how do we develop an understanding of what a peace and conflict studies perspective is. Just a few other notes that I generally don't like to teach with a lot of slides, but I have put together quite a lot of slides since I can't be walking around the room with you all today. I've already uploaded them to our platform, so that way you have access to them and you don't need to be trying to take notes on them. This presentation is built on quite a lot of reading, so I've included a separate bibliography separate from what I originally gave out in the course description. And so if you're interested in what are some of the sources that I've used to develop this, you can check there. Most of them are quite freely available. Most academic journals and research institutions have been very generous in sharing any information that is related to COVID. But if you are having trouble finding any of these sources, let me know and I can find a way to get them to you. So my aim here is to be looking at the nexus between peace, pandemic, and conflict, and to try to weave back and forth both between what we can learn from the past that informs how we understand the situation we are in now, and also how we analyze the situation we are now from a modern and a moral peace perspective, to see how well those lessons from the past really shape the current situation that we are in. If you take a look at what has been written about peace and pandemic, and you don't include up until this COVID pandemic, you see that there is one primary direction in the logic of the research, and that is the question of how do conflicts affect the spread of pandemic diseases. And generally this is fairly well understood. Conflict, especially large-scale, violent, protracted armed conflicts, increase the spread of pandemic diseases. And this is because of damage to the public infrastructure, damage to public health, sanitation, and the erosion of and functioning of trust in and amongst citizens and their governments and communities. All of the breakdown of these systems is the breakdown of a lot of what provides our ability to be healthy together. Further, conflict tends to inhibit effective responses to any cross-cutting issue. So trying to garner political will to address a pandemic during a conflict is often very difficult, though we will discuss some unique cases of this. And this kind of research is usually fit in a larger frame of what they call global health, which emerged in the 1970s as an explicit focus of the UN and related agencies, where they try to shift our understandings of health of populations to that of the entire globe, rather than the health of specific individual nation states. This later evolved into what we now call global health diplomacy, which looks at the intersection between improving health and improving relationships at the same time, or in a reinforcing manner, particularly in conflict-affected areas. So if we're beginning by looking from a modern peace perspective, what does this mean? Of course, I'm sure this has already been discussed at length, but we're looking at the world in a mechanistic way, and one that emphasizes what is in the observable world, things that can be quantified. And the things that we value from the modern frame are things that can be perceived and that can be measured. So peace here is related to things that we value. And those are the things that we can see, measure, accumulate, and by extension, these are things that can be taken. And this fear of loss drives a need for security and the need for institutions to protect it. And This is why we refer to this particular peace perspective as peace out of security. So then if we want to conceptualize, well, what is a pandemic in this regard? We can see it as a risk to security or a threat to security. So then we need to understand risk a bit and to think about, well, what does it look like? What is a pandemic as a kind of risk? And this is a very difficult question to approach because it scales at multiple different levels and it depends a lot on perspective. When I talk with global health people and I talk with epidemiologists or people that work on biosecurity issues, they tend to look at the largest scale perspective and try to assess, well, how dangerous is the pandemic to humanity? That has its place and that will be where I start this discussion, but I'm also very aware that this is not the entirety of it because, of course, if you get infected with and are suffering from COVID or someone that you care about, it has become something of primary importance, no matter what the overall global statistics say. So even though I'm going to be starting kind of from the most extreme example or the highest level of analysis, I'm also keeping the human in mind. And I think that what is useful about starting from a higher level of analysis is it starts to whittle down our frame of discussion and our frame of understanding what kind of risk pandemics in general pose to humanity, and then specifically what does the COVID pandemic threaten humans' long-term survival. So when we look at risks in the context of peace and conflict studies, it can be helpful to distinguish between naturally occurring or anthropogenic or man-made risks. Even though sounds a bit philosophical, I think this is an important distinction because it really shows the differences in the things that can be done. For example, if we consider an asteroid strike to Earth, this is a naturally occurring thing, and there is very little that we can do directly about it. Of course, we can have good monitoring and we can have backup plans and evacuation systems in place in case of such an event. But if we look at a problem such as a nuclear war, this is a human-made problem, and that means there are much more things that we can do about it in terms of diplomacy or denuclearization or creating of different control measures for nuclear materials that gives us options to be able to intervene before a disaster happens. What is curious about pandemics is that they are kind of in between a natural and an anthropogenic risk. And just for the moment here, I'm leaving aside the topic of an engineered pandemic. That would be a different lecture series. So yes, diseases are natural, but much of how we've organized our lives since the beginning of the agricultural revolution is not natural in that way. For example, the way that we farm and produce our food increases transmission from animals to humans, the zoonotic transmission. For example, HIVs originated in chimpanzees, Ebola and SARS both originated in bats, and influenza, multiple strains of influenza, either originate in pigs or birds. And now we have COVID-19, which looks like it may have originally come from bats to humans through an intermediary of the pangolin. And there is some evidence that shows that the overall rate of transmission of diseases, infectious diseases from animals to humans is increasing, although it's hard to know that if this trend is really true because it could also be attributed to our increased ability to detect these things. Another reason for this intermediary place of pandemics is globalization, and of course with the ease of trade and transportation, it's very difficult to control the spread of diseases. And when you look at even how organizations such as the CDC or the WHO look at things such as stopping flights or locking down the borders, they don't think of it as a prevention mechanism. They think of it as a way of slowing the transmission, knowing that all borders are porous and that the diseases will find their way through. I think it's also important to remember that this is nothing new. That humanity, the history of humanity is interwoven with pandemics. We have shaped them and they have shaped us. So if we look at what have the scale of this kind of effect been? So if we look at what has the scale of this kind of effect been? Well, if we take the Black Death, for example, in Europe alone, in the 6 years that it raged, it killed between a quarter and half of all Europeans. And in the Middle East, it killed at least 1 out of every 3 people. And the full extent is still unknown, but most estimates put that in those 6 years, between 5 and 14% of the global population perished. Or another bad example from a bit further back in history was the plague of Justinian in 541 CE. When it hit the Byzantine Empire, in 3 years, it killed 3% of the world population. Or a more recent example, the 1918 Spanish flu. Very quickly, it spread to 6 continents and affected 1/3 of the entire world, and it killed between 3 to 6% of the global population, much more than the First World War. So then, are pandemics a threat to the existence of our species? Well, it seems like an extreme question, but I think it's important to consider, and the good news is that experts seem to say no. Well, why? There are several reasons for this. One is, in the field of epidemiology, there is something called the theory of optimal virulence. It's not in a disease's best interest to lead to the extinction of their host population, because then they can't transmit. And there seems to be, throughout human history, an anti-correlation between infectiousness and lethality. And these two factors tend to try to come into balance with each other over time. There are only a few small number of diseases that kill more than 75% of those people who are infected. And this percentage of death by infection is called the human infection. And this brings us to one of the ways that human infectious diseases can be classified, and this is by their case fatality rate, or CFR, which is the proportion of people diagnosed with a disease who then die from that disease. So if we start with looking at what are some of the worst case scenarios, some diseases with CFEs of over 100% are transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, things such as Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, also called KURU. We also have African trypanosomiasis, or the so-called sleeping sickness, and visceral leishmaniasis are all diseases that kill 100% of the people who are infected. This is similar to diseases like rabies, though if you do have a rabies vaccine, the rate of potential of death goes down quite a lot. Moving a bit down the list, we have some more recent diseases or more prevalent diseases that humanity has had to contend with, such as smallpox variola, which had a CFR of 95%. And much more recently, especially in Congo and in Eastern Africa, and before that in Western Africa, you can see that Ebola has a CFR of between 83 to 90%. This might start to change now that there is a vaccine that has been given out for Ebola, but that was done largely without testing, so it's quite unknown how effective the vaccine is. So up until relatively recently, the most deadly infectious disease for humans on Earth was tuberculosis, killing about 1.6 million people a year. That comes out to 4,000 a day. And that is killing more people annually than malaria and HIV combined. So it was only recently that COVID has now overtaken the virulence of our most previous largest threat. So where does COVID fit in this list? Well, as of October, the CFE is estimated to be somewhere between 0.23 and 1.15%. We can see an interesting effective scale here. Even though COVID appears to be not very deadly, we can still see the havoc that it's wreaked across the world. And it should also call us to be placing attention on the effects of pandemic diseases and how they relate to the overall survivability of humans on Earth. Because if the CFE was even a bit higher, we would be facing a very different situation. Now, there is a tendency that pandemics over time tend to become less virulent, and this tends to happen as the pathogen seeks to optimize itself. This could be what we see happening in the new strains, the new mutations of COVID, which are much more contagious, but maybe about the same level of deadly. And this could be the disease seeking a kind of balance in order to make itself have more chances of survival. But what have the effects been? Like, what are the worst case scenarios from the past? Well, even some of the terrible things that we've endured, such as the bubonic plague, which had a death toll between 25 and 50%, it wasn't wide enough to cause continent wide collapse, but it did have many effects on the fate of nations and empires and culture, and quite a few interesting stories we could pull out of that. I'm sure you could teach a whole course just on this topic. So history tends to tell us that if this pandemic and future pandemics follow trends of the past, our species will survive. So if we take a look at this graph I put up here, this brings us back to this topic I mentioned, existential risk, threats to human survival. An existential risk is defined as an event or phenomenon where adverse outcomes can permanently and drastically curtail human potential. Of course, living is dangerous and understanding risk is important. So one way of conceptualizing risks is to look at their scope, that is the size of the group at risk, and their intensity, how badly each individual would be affected, and their probability, the best current estimates of adverse outcomes. Looking at this graph, we can see that many risks of global intensity are endurable. And that doesn't mean that things like waning biodiversity or moderate global warming or long-term global economic recessions do not wreak havoc and do not cause untold suffering or misery at the global level. But if the events are transitory, it is possible to recover. And once a risk crosses into a terminal category here where our X marks the spot, there is no chance of that. Beyond this, we have the possibility of extinction, and these risks curtail the ability of the human species to flourish. So why I bring all of these up is it helps us to place where different kinds of risk are. Because one of the things I think that is very important when we're developing a peace and conflict studies perspective on this topic is to consider how do we prioritize issues and how do we determine where to place our time, energy, resources, and attention. And this comes from a lot of other reasons that we can get into if that's an interesting topic for you. So this is where I've been positioning my research. But in regards to pandemics, I think the good news and the best proof that naturally occurring existential risks are not a threat to human survival is that we've already been here for 2,000 centuries. Our fossil records indicate that the total risk from natural causes on planet Earth for humans is somewhere between 0 and 0.5% over those 2,000 centuries. And that if you crunch the math on this, that means that rates above a 0.1% chance per century of extinction are incompatible with the evidence of how long we've already been here. And it's important to remember that despite all we have done that increase our chance of being afflicted by pandemics, there are many other things, many other trends that push in the opposite direction. For example, we have a scientific understanding of disease, which for most of human history we did not have. During many of the pandemics that ravaged the planet, we didn't understand what was happening, but now we do. We now have public health bodies and organizations specifically tasked with dealing with this. We have improved sanitation. Generally speaking, humans are much healthier around the world, and we have medicine. And also the human population is very widely spread out, even in very remote areas in Antarctica and other remote islands. So it's very unlikely that we can go extinct as a species. So that's the good news here. So that was a bit of a long road to get to what I want to say, but I think it was important in terms of framing what things that we're not talking about while still stressing the potential dangers that do exist. I think a pandemic can be best described as an indirect risk or a compounding risk. This means that it augments or amplifies other existing trends. So for example, if we take a systems perspective of the world and we imagine the likely economic effects of the COVID pandemic and how they are going to play out, this can very likely and probably will result in the constriction of overseas development aid, particularly in places like Africa. And this gap is going to be filled by China, and currently is being filled by China. And I think that there is going to be a shift in coming, because it seems very likely that the majority of vaccines for Africa are going to come from China, which will further cement the Chinese influence over Africa, which is not necessarily good or bad, but we do have to remember things like, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, The vast majority of the world's coltan comes from there. It's actually the inspiration for the movie Wakanda, and coltan is needed for making almost every piece of modern electronics that we use. So we could see the potential for rivalry between the US and China stemming from this system situation here. And then when we combine that with the already existing artificial intelligence arms race that is happening between the US and China, we could see how many different risks could compound into quite a dangerous situation. Or a similar way these events could go as funding priorities now shift away or shift towards quelling the pandemic. We could imagine that the attention and resources devoted to working on issues of climate change will not be at the levels that they need, and that climate change will seem to get much worse and much faster than predicted. And we can already know that the overall effect on issues of migration and security are going to be profound. And we know that this can become a very destabilizing factor in many different conflict-affected areas, and see very easily how such a system could spiral out of control. So it is in this way that I think we can look at how pandemics relate to security. And if we back up to the beginning of the pandemic, there was a moment, right around February, where the world seemed to really get a sense of how dangerous and how widespread this problem was going to be. And for a few months, there were some promising signs for peace and hopes of a Pax Pandemica. The idea or the hope that a common enemy of the COVID virus would be something that would allow us to come together as a people, and something that would allow for a cessation of conflicts around the world as we work together to tackle this problem. And this is very much rooted in modern thinking and realist logic of politics. For example, pandemics make war much more difficult. A primary source of military power is economics, and the economic contractions that we've already started seeing since the beginning of the pandemic, and the few of future recessions originally had put a limit on military spending, and this was started to shift priorities away from war-making industries. Secondly, diseases do not take sides. Militaries are very ill-equipped to fight diseases, and soldiers and sailors are particularly vulnerable to infectious diseases given the way that they have to live and interact with each other. These these factors may explain the initial decreases in military expenditures earlier in the year of 2020. In his book, The Causes of War, quite an old book now, but I think an important one, Geoffrey Blindley writes that wars often start when belligerent parties are optimistic, because the elites that make the decisions to go to war are more confident and willing to take risks, and this makes them much less likely to negotiate. And if we turn the logic the other way around, we can also think that peace may really be more possible in situations of pessimism, that peace may be best served by pessimism. And so this was, I think, part of the deeper philosophical current that was shaping the original hopes for a Pax Pandemica. Also, throughout the historical record, there is very little evidence to support the idea that epidemics have caused wars, or that wars were deliberately started during times of widespread outbreaks of infectious diseases. So now let's try to get a sense of how did this all play out. So in mid-March, the United Nations Secretary General made a call for a global ceasefire for all conflicts all around the world, to open corridors for aid and to create possibilities for diplomacy. And he famously said, "The fury of this virus illustrates the folly of war." So what are some of the results we saw then, and then how have those played out? Well, there were originally quite a lot of unilateral ceasefires. So we can see that in May in Afghanistan, the Taliban unilaterally declared a 3-day ceasefire during Eid that was accepted by the government. In Angola, in April, the Front for the Liberation of Enclave of Cabinda declared a 4-week ceasefire. In Cameroon, the Southern Cameroonian Defense Force declared a 2-week ceasefire for permitting international humanitarian aid to come in preparation for the COVID-19 pandemic. In Colombia, the National Liberation Army announced a temporary unilateral ceasefire with the government. In India, the Communist Party of India announced a ceasefire in the Red Corridor regions of India to help contain the COVID pandemic. In Indonesia, the West Papuan National Liberation Army and the Free Papua Organization declared a ceasefire in April. In Libya, the UN-supported interim government of Libya endorsed cessation of hostilities to allow local authorities to respond to the COVID pandemic. This was followed by the Libyan National Army committing to the ceasefire later in March. And in Myanmar, the Brotherhood Alliance, or the Northern Alliance of the Arakan Army, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, and the Tang National Liberation Army declared an extension to a pre-COVID ceasefire in April. This was quite remarkable because those are groups that have stood outside of the current nationwide ceasefire and peace agreement. The Tatmadaw, or the Burmese military, issued a 4-month ceasefire in response to this call. In the Philippines, President Duterte quite surprisingly declared a unilateral ceasefire with the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army in March. In South Sudan, the Opposition Movement Alliance renewed its commitment to the current cessation of hostilities, which was followed by the Sudan's People Liberation Movement in the north extending the ceasefire. In Syria, we saw that the General Command of the Syrian Democratic Forces announced a humanitarian truce to allow warring parties to focus on their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in Thailand, the National Revolutionary Front, which is a group in the Patani region in the south, they declared a unilateral open-ended ceasefire with the Thai royal government in early April. And in Yemen, the government of Yemen declared a ceasefire against the Houthi rebels in April. So those were all unilateral ceasefires. Then we shift briefly to bilateral or multilateral ceasefires. And we can see one that occurred between Armenia and Azerbaijan in late October. Another one in Libya, where there was a permanent ceasefire of the Libyan Army of the Government of National Accord and the General Command of the National Army. And in Nigeria, there was quite a remarkable intercommunal ceasefire in Benue State. This is a ceasefire amongst many different warring tribal family groups over agricultural land and pastoral land. And in the Ukraine, we saw that there was a ceasefire agreed between Ukraine, Russia, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And this happened in July. There were quite a few other small instances of promising signs. For example, the United Wa State Army in Myanmar, an ethnic armed group there, they decided to take over the responsibility for the COVID-19 response to deliver pandemic supplies to ethnic minorities, citing that they had the trust of local communities and the abilities to access these remote areas much better than the national government could do. And Israel and Hamas began negotiations for a prisoner swap, which later ended up occurring. So these are all quite promising trends. There is one note one caveat to add here, is that in the logic of armed group conflict, many of these ceasefires were initially called in an open-ended way or unilateral way by the armed groups fighting their governments themselves. Quite often, this is a tactic that armed groups use in order to buy themselves more time to reorganize and resupply themselves. So I think that we will see in the coming months and year to what extent these ceasefires really meant what they were intended to. So then we look at, well, how did this play out? How was there a Pax Pandemica? Well, keeping at our current level of analysis, shortly after the call for a global ceasefire, the UN Secretary General issued a set of concerns to the Security Council because we were really starting to get a sense of the social and economic and political impacts of the COVID pandemic far beyond it as only a health crisis. He expressed his worry of threats that exist to peace and security, and he identified 8 main areas of risk. So what I'd like to do now is to kind of walk through each of these. What was the risk that he pointed out, why, and what have we seen so far based on the information and analysis that is available. And I'll point out that much of the hard data is only up until maybe December at the latest, and there hasn't really been much since then, and much of the data that most people have to work with actually ends in last October. So the Secretary General's First fear is that the pandemic would threaten to erode trust in public institutions, because if citizens feel that their government is not handling the pandemic well, they are less likely to trust in that governance, and this loss of control can lead to a lot of challenges in governance. And I think that we've seen this in many places across the world, where a lack of effective response really undermined the legitimacy of governments and institutions. And we have seen this spread out, particularly in places like the US, but others as well, leading to a mistrust in the media and science itself. So much of the previous research on Ebola in conflict, particularly in the Congo, shows how important this is. And this was one of the main hurdles to quelling the last Ebola outbreak, is that there was so little trust between populations and the national government, particularly in the Eastern Democratic Republic, Congo. And also there was a deep mistrust of foreigners who provided the majority of the external aid and support in trying to stop the pandemic. I think that there's also been this element of what has been called the infodemic. Being so inundated with information has made trust more difficult. There's been some Reuters studies that show that social media has been estimated to be the source of 88% of all misinformation. And then we think of countries like Myanmar, where the vast majority of internet usage is only on Facebook, and we can see how this can contribute to very difficult situations. Because there have been studies, one done by the University College of London, I believe, by mapping out the brain, how waves of disinformation contribute to a kind of neural information overload that crowds out the ability to discern which information is important and which information is not important. His second point of concern is that the economic fallout of this crisis could create major stressors, particularly in fragile societies and those in transition. Economic instability has a particularly devastating impact on women, and these women make up the vast majority of the sectors of unemployment that were most affected. So, for example, the World Bank, one of their projects called the Global Economic Prospects, currently envisions a 5.2% contraction in GDP in 2020. The pandemic is expected to plunge most countries into a recession, and it's the largest per capita income contraction globally since 1870, with the steepest downgrades in consensus growth projected since 1990. The economic distress alone of COVID-19 may push at least 500 million of people into poverty, and we do know that poverty is a strong correlate of susceptibility to both infection with disease and also your potential from dying from that disease. We can also see that these economic contractions, that if they lead to long-term recessions, are likely to create a dramatic drop in the contributions to overseas development aid, currently predicted to be around a funding shortfall of about $25 billion by mid-2021, which is of course concerning for development, stabilization, peace building, and peacekeeping projects around the world. The Secretary General's third point of concern related to the postponement of elections or referenda or decisions needed that need votes to proceed, and that this would create an undermining of legitimacy and create political tensions and some windows for opportunism. Since the beginning of the pandemic, elections have been held in some kind at some level in 101 countries. There have been about 75 postponed. The overall impact of this on peace and security remains yet to be seen, but I can say from my experience that it does cause a lot of problems. In the Congo, they've used Ebola for quite a while to delay elections, and then they were further delayed by the COVID pandemic, and this has resulted in a situation where you have a government who is still in power for many years past when their mandate has ended, with no foreseeable way for a democratic change for that governance. Our fourth point brought up by the Secretary General is that in situations of conflict, the uncertainty created by the pandemic may create incentives for actors to promote further disorder and turmoil, and lead to an escalation of violence. So this then moves us from looking at our positive picture of ceasefires to really considering the question of, well, what has violence looked like since the beginning of the pandemic. So if we look at 6 months back before the beginning of the pandemic, and we look at instances of armed conflict by the ACEDA project, which tracks these things, we can see that this is what the general spread of conflict worldwide looked like. And now if we overlay this with the infection data, we can see that there appears to have little change on existing patterns of conflict. Now we look at the same data disaggregated over time and by event, and we can see that there has been no decline in armed conflict during the first 5 months of the pandemic. And when we inspect the data further, it shows that in some countries and in some conflict-afflicted areas such as Libya and Nigeria, conflict has actually been on an increase. So this brings us to the question of, well, why has the COVID pandemic failed to create an incentive for halting hostilities? Why has the common enemy of a pandemic not brought people to lay down their arms? If you survey the preliminary research on this topic, we can see that there are several proposed answers to this question. The first is that the effect of the pandemic having on underlying root causes of conflict and deep-seated tensions is like putting more pressure on those cracks and causing them to rupture and to come to the surface. And this is also exacerbated by all of the social and political and economic inequalities that were already existing, and how the economic downturns from the COVID pandemic have increased the amount of job losses, which have disproportionately affected the youth, and who are the people most likely to be able to be recruited to violence. We've also seen that there has been massive disruptions to the global food supply chain, and this has caused a lot of grievances and mistrust. This has been particularly true in Africa, where the continent, by and large, is a net food importer and does not produce the majority of the food that it consumes. So Africa has already long struggled with food security challenges, and that this has been greatly exacerbated by the difficulty in shipping goods. It's projected that the broader economic fallout of the pandemic is likely to hit conflict-affected areas the worst, and to have that effect manifest over the long term. There has been worsened gender inequalities worldwide. And conflicts tend to concentrate in low-income countries, where women are more likely than men to be in the informal sector of employment and thus be more susceptible to losing their jobs. And in conflict-affected countries, low state capacity in conflict-prone areas can lead to really poor or insufficient or non-existent public health responses, which is made worse when there is low or no trust in the government already, so that the people would not accept those services even if they are provided. There's also been a large-scale stoking of hatred and fear towards refugees, migrants, and IDPs since the beginning of the pandemic. I'd say that this is quite worldwide and has created massive problems for the already difficult work of dealing with migration-related issues and migration-affected conflict. Another set of explanations hinges around the opportunities for political and military exploitation of the crisis by governments and non-state actors. So across the world, we have seen many openings created where the pandemic has been used to attack and arrest critics of the government, to arrest human rights, to impose unchecked emergency laws, and to arrest journalists. We've seen large-scale curtailment of political and civil liberties, which are likely to persist in the aftermath of the pandemic. One of the things that's been said about the history of pandemics in humanity is that they are opportunities for the consolidation of state power, and that in this consolidation, governments tend to not want to give up the power once consolidated. We've also seen very worrying trends of rising authoritarianism across the globe. We've also seen very worrying trends of rising authoritarianism across the globe. And we've also seen that governments have shifted resources away from peace efforts, which has allowed belligerent actors to regroup and take the opportunities to attack what they now see as a weakened opponent. The fifth point of concern brought up by the Secretary General is that the threat of terrorism remains alive, and that terrorist groups may see this as a window to strike when the attention of governments are turned towards the pandemic. There was also a fear, which seems to be confirmed, that many people at home locked down and online all the time has led to a massive increase in people becoming radicalized or drawn into extremist groups. Though if we look at the actual data, the Global Terrorism Index, the GTI, found that deaths from terrorism is still on a decrease. And for the fifth consecutive year in a row, after a peak in 2014, the number of deaths by terrorism has decreased by 59%, down to 13,826 deaths. And it's still holds to be true that conflict is the primary driver of terrorism, that 96% of all of the deaths that occurred in 2019 as a result of terrorism were in countries that were already considered to be in conflict. We have seen other trends in regards to terrorism, though. So in North America, Western Europe, and Oceania, far-right attacks have increased about 250% since 2014, and it's been higher now than any time in the last 50 years. And we've also seen a downturn in the global economic impact of terrorism. In 2020, it was 16.4 billion US dollars, which has been a decrease of 25% since the year before. There are some considerations to put into our analysis here that restrictions of movements and gatherings may have been limiting recruitment, and while also increasing a significant amount of online recruitment. But if we also think in a broader perspective on the deeper logic of terrorism, one of the main objectives of terrorism and violent extremism is to gain outreach by spreading fear. And now, since the media is focused on the pandemic, there may be actually less incentive to commit acts of terrorism because there would be less coverage of them. It's you would have to become scarier than the pandemic itself for the message to work. It could also be that terrorist groups have not had the ability to protect their own people from the COVID-19 pandemic, and that this could explain part of the downturn. I do wonder if what we're seeing, though, is a delay in the system, we could say, from a systems theory perspective, that the massive increase in online recruitment may manifest in a year or two in an uptick of terrorist attacks, but we will have to see how that pans out. So the sixth point that the Secretary General brought up was about the weakness and lack of preparedness exposed by the pandemic might create a window for bioterror attacks, because you see how quickly a disease has spread, and then you could imagine how effective a bioweapon would be. Luckily, we haven't seen any bioterror attacks since the pandemic. But as a bit of a background to where this fear lies, is that with their increased access and availability of gene splicing and editing technology such as CRISPR-9, and the dramatically lowered cost for engaging with these technologies, makes the production of bioweapons much easier. One professor that I work with, who is a professor of biotechnology, and one of the people very much concerned with this topic, became concerned with it when he realized that 1/4 of all of the students he has in each of his classrooms possess the know-how to create themselves a virus that could destroy millions of people's lives. And so this is paired with the question of what we call dual-use technology and research. So how do we deal with the tension between wanting to continue to develop new research and to not restrict that, but also knowing that that research then could become used for nefarious purposes? And then how do we treat the issue of freedom of speech and freedom of expression? As a quick aside, we have this example of mousepox. Mousepox is very similar to human smallpox, and it is still studied as a way of further understanding these types of viruses. And there are a set of types of experiments that are internationally forbidden, but they're not regulated in a way that it's actually possible to stop them. And some of those are increasing how deadly or how contagious a disease is, and another is finding ways to make vaccines not effective. And there was an example of a researcher in China who found a way to take mousepox and to raise its lethality from 30% to 100%, and also to keep that 100% lethality in mice that have already been vaccinated for mousepox. So this is very worrying for both of these issues. And his research was published in an academic journal, including the methodology, which created quite a difficult issue to deal with, because you don't want to get in the habit of suppressing scientific information and transparency and collaboration. But the methodology section of this paper is potentially very dangerous because it gives instructions on how exactly to weaponize a virus. This leads us to complex questions of what they call information-based hazards or info hazards. So for example, the same professor works with a, a company that supplies genetic material for people doing biotechnology experiments. And they want him to be able to provide them with a list of things to not sell people so that they don't get the precursor agents in order to make a bioweapon. But what he struggles with is that the moment he tells a company what things to not sell, he's actually made this situation much more dangerous because those things are now known, which then can be used as weapons. And this is, I think, a very under-researched and conceptualized connection between the biological sciences and peace and conflict studies and how we can deal with these issues. This fear is further compounded by the lack of overall effective regulation and control measures for biological agents. And paired with, there is a history of use and proof of concept. If we think about the Shinrikyo attacks in Tokyo, I mean, that was with sarin nerve gas, so it was a chemical weapon and not a bioweapon. But when their factories were raided, they did find that they had created strains of Ebola and were attempting to resurrect strains of smallpox. So the seventh point the Secretary General brought up is that the crisis has hindered international and national conflict resolution efforts, particularly in moments where they are needed the most. At the level of track one level peace processes, we can see that there has been a lot of hindrance, particularly in Africa. So if we look at now, there's been delays or stoppages of peace processes in Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there was also a delay in Syria, and it was only later restarted in Geneva, I believe. And the Colombian peace process was also stalled. But if we take our level of analysis down from track 1 to tracks 2 and 3, we can see that the peace processes at this level have also been hindered. For example, in Myanmar, they had just signed a nationwide ceasefire, which is a product of many years of work bringing individual armed groups into an overall comprehensive ceasefire agreement. In order to keep this agreement working and to keep the ceasefires obeyed, requires a lot of track 2 and track 3 work to support the parties on both sides. There's also a changing allocation of resources, and the funding landscape for most track 2 and 3 peace process work has changed dramatically in the last year. There's much less resources overall, and it's much more difficult to get access to those resources. And if we think about how dialogue processes work in the context of larger peace processes, that these kinds of dialogue processes often depend on in-person gatherings at the local level that require a high degree of mobility, and these are greatly hindered by social distancing measures. And often the very same people who do the work of dialogue projects are the same people that become involved in trying to provide pandemic relief to remote areas. So you now have the same people pulled in two different directions and not being able to maintain the dialogue process work that is needed. In many places, there has been an increase in anti-foreigner sentiment, seeing the foreigners as those that have carried diseases into their country. The involvement of foreigners is a critical part of many different peace processes for different reasons around the world, so this has also been a limiting factor. And this brings us to our eighth point of concern raised by the Secretary General, and that is that the pandemic could trigger or exacerbate human rights challenges. And I think that we've already seen the evidence of this, that the long-standing grievances around the world and systems of cultural and structural violence have shown to still be there and to be further brought into the light by the challenges of the pandemic. The pandemic has been very often used as a cover for repression and consolidation of state power. The quelling of free speech also has been cause for the locking down of migration pathways, as well as related to the rise of extremism and hate speech, and has overall created an overall shrinking civic space for the freedom of expression, which is an essential component of being able to safeguard, maintain, and promote human rights. So this paints quite a scary picture, perhaps. But now I'd like to turn a bit to what are some considerations for peace building and conflict transformation amidst a pandemic. So what I've done here is taken the research and the considerations and the recommendations from many international peace groups and kind of synthesize them along their general trends. And many of these recommendations stem from what is perhaps unique about a COVID pandemic is its effect on our ability to work together in the way that we're used to working together. If you look at Yuval Noah Harari's book *Sapiens* and *Homo Deus*, when he traces the evolution of human history, he says that it is the ability of humans to collaborate and to work together, which is the primary reason that we survived and thrived as a species, the ability to tap in and harness our collective intelligence. And the pandemic has deeply affected this. If you think about any other kind of disaster, whether it be a large forest fire, an earthquake, or a tsunami, there are things that kind of normal non-experts can do. You can bring in food and blankets, you can help with rebuilding, but because of the requirements of the pandemic, most of what could be done is actually just doing nothing and leaving it to professionals. And I think that this has been a continuing call for creativity, openness, and innovation in ways of being together and ways of understanding, collaborating, and working together. I think another important consideration is if we think about the different systems that make up the world from a systems theory point of view. One of the key points of systems theory is that systems are highly resilient against change unless they're faced with massive large-scale disruption. So large-scale disruption and disasters tend to be able to also be opportunities for transformation or for peace. And one of the best examples of this is in Aceh in Indonesia. There had been a long-going civil war there for many years, and it really had gotten to an intractable place. Then when the December tsunami in 2004 came and killed 250,000 people just in that region alone, that was enough to create an opening for a peace process that was successful between the Acehnese and the Indonesian government. There's also been a call for recording and making public the information that supports the linkages between pandemic and conflicts to show the interrelationship between these two issues. And also a call for caution and for practicing conflict-sensitive aid delivery. This is one of the main lessons learned in the last Ebola outbreak in the Congo. And you could see this manifest on so many different levels. For example, one of the problems came from, in certain areas, a traditional practice when someone dies is that you take the body and you bring it into a body of water, like a lake or a pond, and together with the family you bathe the body to prepare it for the funeral. But if you think about how Ebola is transferred, this is the worst thing you could possibly do because this is how it moves. But how do you get people to stop or to change their deeply held, long-standing cultural practices, particularly as outsiders, in a way that is acceptable or a way that can be heard? These are very difficult issues. And there seems to be an overarching trend in the recommendations for peace builders to really focus on multi-level, multi-sectoral trust building, and as one of the precursors for cooperation in general, as cooperation is the key element of being able to address the pandemic. Another ray of hope is that there is precedent for cooperation in times of pandemics, even amongst rival parties. One of the most often cited examples is the collaboration between the United States and the Soviet Union amidst the Cold War to develop and improve and administer the polio vaccine, which is quite remarkable if you think about that. Also, during times of political and instability and conflict, there have been examples of regional cooperation even amongst countries that have not had good relations or have a long history of conflict and distrust. We can look at the development of the Mekong Basin Disease Surveillance Network, which included Cambodia, China, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, which was started in 1999, particularly to address the avian flu, but then expanded to work on typhoid and malaria. or the Middle East Consortium on Infectious Disease Surveillance, which was a collaboration between Jordan, Israel, and Palestine in 2002, originally started to address the H1N1 outbreak, which, if you think of the long-standing political tensions between these countries, is quite remarkable to get regional cooperation on such an issue. And also the East African Integrated Disease Surveillance Network, which was started in 2000, comprised of Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and later Rwanda and Burundi, which also was an example amongst of countries who generally do not trust each other very well, finding ways to cooperate in addressing pandemic diseases. So we've looked at the pandemic stuff. We've tried to assess it through the modern frame, and primarily because that this seems to be the main frame in which it's interpreted in the world. But we can also see how we can reach out beyond the moral frame through our transrational approach and engage with other perspectives in order to complexify our analysis. So if we consider our moral pieces, our piece out of justice, we have a whole host of issues here. As we have discussed, the pandemic has surfaced many long-standing grievances, and many of these are based on justice. We'll be facing a host of moral questions about who gets access to the vaccine, why, and under which conditions. And I think issues of justice have been made very evident in the ways that we've seen the Black Lives Matter protests and movement around the world, or more specifically looking at protests against things such as the SARS units in Nigeria, or the movements to remove intellectual property rights on the COVID vaccine to speed recovery, all call into question the issue of justice in how we deal with the pandemic. If we look to our postmodern perspectives, or piece out of truth, or piece out of truths, of course we've seen, particularly in the US, but elsewhere as well, an assault on the idea of truth, the idea of consensus reality, a mistrust of science and experts. And we've also seen the coming into conflict different truths or competing truths. I saw this playing out in the US media as the dilemma is between, do we want safety or do we want Christmas? And that this is a curious question from a postmodern perspective, because there are two competing claims of value and how you orient your life. You can also think about this in terms of a question of you choosing to wear a mask versus someone telling you you have to wear a mask, and who in which conditions has the ability to tell you to do that, and what gives them the authority to do so. And I think that there's even a lens to be considered in regards to truth about what this whole network of phenomenon even means. So if we then consider our energetic peace families, or peace from harmony, we can of course see that there have been severe effects on interpersonal relationships, but also the amazing resilience displayed by people in times of crisis to work together and to triumph over adversity. And I think it's also been an interesting experiment in us learning what relating looks like at a distance in terms of cooperation and for community building and for learning. So that's brought me to the end of my initial remarks on this question. And what I would like to do now is to leave a discussion question for you to talk about in your individual groups. If you can take some time to discuss these questions, and then we'll come back together as a whole group for a bit of further discussion. See you then.